Hey everybody, I went to go see the Iron Claw. If you are a professional wrestling fan, you most likely have heard of it. You know the gist of what the movie is about, and if you don't, let me give you a little bit of a preview. The Iron Claw follows the tale of the Von Erich wrestling family in the 1980s, early 1990s in Texas. The Von Erichs were wrestling royalty when it comes to wrestling at that time. The Von Erich patriarch, Fritz Von Erich, he himself was a 3-time world champion. And not surprisingly, his boys followed in his footsteps. Now, when talking about the facts of the Von Erich family, you have to understand that film and real life don't always go hand in hand. The Iron Claw is based on a true story, and there are some things in the film that don't depict exactly what happened in the life of the Von Erichs. For example, there were originally 6 Von Erich brothers. There was Jack Von Erich, Kevin, David, Carrie, Mike, and Chris. Now, in the Iron Claw movie, you will follow the lives of 4 of them. You will follow Kevin, David, Carrie, and Mike. I looked into why Chris was left out of the movie, and in short, the tragedy of the film itself already depicted what it needed to depict, and they didn't feel the need to include Chris. With that being said, certain events and the timeline is a little wonky as far as when things happen. For example, Kevin Von Erich got married earlier in the 80s. It depicts that he got married in the mid-80s. He had 4 kids. His first 2 children were girls, and they depict that he only had the 2 sons that were firstborn. So people could go back and forth all day long, nitpicking little things, about the facts of the Von Erich family. I don't necessarily care about all of that. I know the story of the Von Erich family. If you do some research, you can find it as well. Film is film, and it's meant to depict a story. I think the story was depicted beautifully. I hate going to the movie theater. I hate going to the movie theater. I hate being around other people. I hate listening to people chew on their popcorn. I hate listening to them suck through their straws trying to get the last drops of their soda. I hate listening to people snore. I can't stand movie theaters. However, I knew I needed to go see the Iron Claw. I knew I needed to do it. So I put my big girl pants on and I went to the Cinemark Movies 14 and I went and saw the Iron Claw. And I'm very glad that I did. I enjoyed the Iron Claw so much, in fact, that I went and saw it twice. And now that I've seen it twice and I've done all of my crazy hyper obsessive research of behind the scenes and the actors and the people that were involved, I feel ready to talk about it. Another big reason that I don't go to the movies very often is that, like I said, I get hyper obsessive. So really the main thing that I hyper obsessed about is professional wrestling. Professional wrestling, for the most part, are storylines throughout the week that I can get involved in and that distract me from the woes of real life. When I watch something like the Iron Claw, I get sucked into not only the harshness of the reality of life, but the harshness of the reality of time. Before I get into the severity of my review, I want to point out how deeply I felt in a way that made me feel sad. I felt sad. This is why I can't watch movies, because I get emotional. The movie itself is super sad. These are real humans that had really awful things happen to them, and it's a really tragic story. But when we're talking about a time period like the 1980s, early 1990s, when it comes to professional wrestling, you can't replicate moments like that. You can't replicate emotions like that. There's a scene in the movie where Kerry Von Erich faces Ric Flair in a match for the NWA World Heavyweight title. I went on YouTube and I found that match in real time, the original, and I watched it. And I don't care what anyone says, you can go back and watch a moment from 30 years ago and you can feel the emotion in that stadium. The way that the girls screeched for Kerry Von Erich, the way that Ric Flair gave his all in that match because he knew how much it meant after the death of David Von Erich. I sobbed watching the match on YouTube. People can say a lot of things about Ric Flair, but when it comes to that match and that particular situation, give Ric Flair his flowers, knowing how important that moment was and giving it to the Von Erich family and putting Kerry over in the way that he did and selling the absolute living piss out of it. Now, I don't want to go through and give you a play-by-play of the entire movie and ruin it for you, but I do want to give you some of my thoughts and takeaways of things that stood out to me that I felt were very important. The Iron Claw does take place mainly blatantly in the 80s, and it's very apparent from the get-go that Fritz von Erich is a hard ass. He is. And that's very normal at that time. It's very normal for fathers at that time. You know, they were born, Kevin von Erich himself said, you know, he was born around the time of the Great Depression. You know, men were men and you weren't allowed to have emotions and you weren't allowed to cry. And it's apparent that the Von Erich boys were raised that way. Every time tragedy strikes or anytime something happens, they are forced to be stone-faced. They're forced to be men. They're not allowed to show emotion. So I think one of the biggest takeaways for me is watching the evolution of Kevin von Erich when he meets his wife, Pam. Pam is really kind of the first person to show him real raw emotion and allow him to be emotional and express his emotions. When he discloses to her that his oldest brother passed away, you know, when he was only 5 years old, and the empathy that she has for him in giving that hug, it's almost as if no one ever told him that they were sorry about it before. And it's almost like it's the beginning of a healing process for him. I know that there were a lot of people that went to go see the movie without any knowledge of professional wrestling or the Von Erich family in general, and they thought they were going to see a film about, you know, a band of brothers. And it is a movie about a band of brothers, but it is also about the tragedy that strikes them. And I don't have words to really express the feelings of what transpired. Those are real people with real lives and people who loved them. And I cannot fathom what any of them went through or what anyone around them went through. So to critique the way in which their deaths were depicted or how things were changed just feels silly to me. As long as their memory was done right and it was approved by their loved ones, I can't really say much about that. But it was hard hitting. It did what it was supposed to do, and I felt their losses when it happened. Now, when it comes to the people that depicted every character, I thought they did an amazing job. I thought Zac Efron really embodied the you know, the Southern Texas mentality and stature of Kevin Von Erich. I think Zac was a little bit bigger, but David embodied David. Carrie embodied Carrie in the way that he moved himself and his presence. And I had seen a lot of people say, oh, well, you know, Carrie Von Erich was 6'3" and he was the biggest of all of them. And yes, he was, but it's a movie, and leave Jeremy alone. I think Jeremy did a stellar job in depicting, you know, the mental anguish of Carrie Von Erich. The character that I empathized with the most, I feel, was Michael Von Erich. Mike was the littlest of the brothers. He just wanted to make his dad proud. He got into wrestling and he didn't even want to get into wrestling. He was artsy. He was a musician. My heart just absolutely broke for him and his story and his eventual end. I can't remember if it was Kevin Von Erich himself or who had said it, but that the movie should be taken in as a story of survival, not a story of loss. And if it did anything, the amount of respect I have for Kevin Von Erich is tenfold. Kevin Von Erich is a soldier. Kevin Von Erich has been through the worst of the worst, and truly his family saved him. It's very heartwarming to watch interviews of him. Even at the end of the movie, the picture of him and his entire family, you know, he went and bought land in Kauai and moved his whole family there, and they grew up there when they left Texas. And now I believe that some of the family came back to Texas and they bought another farm, and they all live together, and they're so family oriented. I knew very little about Kevin Von Erich's children until the movie came out. I did watch a few of their matches. I most recently saw them on AEW, and I just watched them in Ring of Honor, and they are incredible. I can't believe that I haven't seen much of them before based on how freaking good they are. But I find myself just rooting for them. Like the final scenes after all is said and done, really the film just, it sticks with you. And it stuck with me for a week, to the point where I had to go back and see it again. This is why I can't go see movies, because I get very invested in them, especially when the subject matter pertains to something that I really care about. Okay, let me rapid fire like 3 things that people keep asking me instead of like droning on forever. 1, how did I feel about Ric Flair? Ric Flair was depicted in the film. How did I feel about the actor? Okay, he's played by Aaron Dean Eisenberg. Now, this poor man is getting torn apart. Ric Flair is a larger-than-life character. I cannot imagine that he is easy to completely replicate. Now, when I first saw him on screen the first time I saw the film, I was kind of like, okay. It's kind of like he dipped in and out of feeling Ric Flair. There were times where he spoke and it really sounded like him, and there were times where he didn't sound like him at all. After Ric's match with Kevin is in the locker room with Kerry and his dad, and Ric Flair waltzes in bloody-faced, and that is when I feel like he really embodied Ric the most. He walks in and he's like, give you a match anytime. Where's there a place to get fucked up around here? Like that was very, very Ric Flair. So I'm not going to be hypercritical of that. The only thing I'll be critical of is maybe he really could have wooed better. His woos were, very screechy. I try not to get caught up in nostalgia too much and wishing for things that, that aren't reality. But part of me, as much as I love professional wrestling today, as much as I've enjoyed being a wrestling fan since I was a kid, there is that part of me that wishes I could have experienced wrestling in the 80s and 90s in this era myself. And there's a little bit of sadness and longing for that, even though I know that that's not like a reality. Thanks for listening to me talk about the Iron Claw. Definitely go see it if you haven't. If you are not subscribed, please do tap the bell for notifications so that you know every time I release a new video. You guys have a great day. Bye.